Hi, everyone. I'm Tracie Potts, and this is the Perspectives podcast of the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College. Usually I have a student sitting here with me, but not today. But I do have a student. I have a student of history sitting here with me today, Lee Hawkins, who is a fellow journalist, a friend, and now a noted author of his very popular book, I Am Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. Lee is our Scharf lecturer for this year. So this is a lecture that the Institute does to focus on current events. And we'll talk about, I really want to get into that, but I want to go back first. I want to talk about this book that you've written about your family's history that really applies to a lot of our history. Tell us a little bit about it and tell me why you wrote it.
I wrote it, the book is an intergenerational exploration of one black family in America, one black American family going all the way back to the 1600s. If you saw the movie Roots, or if you read the book, in some ways it's similar, except it shows me from ages 0 to 17 and how the history influenced the way I was raised, my perception of America.
So the book's about your family,
yes, about
to clarify.
My family,
yeah.
Yes, about my family and the way that I was raised and my perception of America, my family's perception of America, and how we lived through the generations, both the darkness and the light, the trauma and the health and well-being, and looking at how we can liberate our bloodlines from the difficult parts so that every generation gets better. And I think that's the goal for every American, to make sure that their family, that their bloodline continues to improve, and that every generation redeems the sacrifices of the previous ones in ways that we can all be proud of.
A big theme in this book is how slavery impacted generations of your family, and your father is a central character in this book. Tell us about your dad, and tell us about, you actually do a podcast about what happened in Alabama, and this is a big theme in the book that I think is appropriate to say haunted your father throughout his life.
Yes, and I think that one thing that we're often not taught when we go through our K-12 experience, or even in college or as American citizens, is that like South Africa, America had a 100-year system of apartheid. It's called Jim Crow segregation. But when I did an investigation into my father's life and I interviewed my father, I started to realize more that no, it was very similar to what was in South Africa. And there are 8 million or more than 8 million survivors still living today who lived through this system where they grew up and they didn't have constitutional rights compared to white Americans. And we've had 60 years only in which black people in America have had full constitutional rights. And so that tension and the aspects of that people wouldn't talk about, we hear so much about Rosa Parks and we hear so much about Martin Luther King Jr., and we hear about how they protested Jim Crow, but we don't really do a good job, I think, understanding and teaching what Jim Crow really was. And when I did my investigation, I got an insight into what happened in Alabama, because my father would not speak about his experience in Jim Crow, which is like a lot of people, a lot of people's families. And so I really wanted to investigate that, and I found out that Jim Crow was something much more different than I thought. And then the other thing is that this book is about one family, and I'm not saying that it represents the stories of all Black Americans, because it doesn't, but there are people who are descendants of slavery and Jim Crow who could really relate to it. And there are also people outside of our community whose families are proud families and proud of their heritage, but would have gone through atrocities. You know, there are people who went through Japanese incarceration. There are people who went through Holocaust. There are people who went through Armenian genocide, Irish and Italian displacement. There were lynchings of Italian people. And every generation is affected by those atrocities. And so overall, I would say that I'm looking a lot at the violence of our country in the origin stage and how that affected a lot of the families and how we can reckon with that, because I believe that every mass shooting, every homicide, everything that we see today traces back to the violence in our society that we haven't reckoned with. And what Martin Luther King was trying to do with his nonviolent social change was address that external in the sense of protest. What I'm trying to do is address it in the home, in the family, in the community, to live nonviolent lives.
This lecture is the third time I've had an opportunity to have an audience with you, so I should probably go back and explain to people a little bit about our connection. We were both fellows at the USC Center for Health Journalism. I kind of quickly referenced that we were both journalists, but we were both fellows in this journalism program that looks at this wide perspective on health and community health. And this was really helpful, I've heard you say, in writing your book, because while you knew and discovered your family's history, your research then connected it to things like intergenerational trauma and ACEs, which I know we've had a chance to talk about, adverse childhood experiences and how that impacts. And so your background as a journalist, as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, as someone who covered the world, really helped you also tell your own story, but do it in a substantive way with the research to back it up.
Yes, child well-being was the focus when I did the USC Center for Health Journalism Fellowship, and they brought in all of these amazing experts, you know, the world's foremost experts on adverse childhood experiences. And when I was researching and listening, Tracie, to the data, I was recognizing my own family.
You said that's me.
Yeah, and friends and different people. You know, I think that even today, when people are reckoning with difficult aspects of their lives, a lot of times it goes back to childhood. And childhood trauma, I believe, is potentially one of the biggest mental health issues in our country right now that we have to deal with. And I think that there are ways to deal with it. And one of the big ways is to investigate family history and to get the why behind why you were raised a certain way. You know, in my book, I talk a lot about the discipline aspect, you know, that I received corporal punishment as a kid, hit with a belt. You know, in 17 states, in schools, it's legal to hit children with a wooden paddle 3 times. And it's mainly the states where slavery was legal and where Jim Crow was legal. So once again, my curiosity about how that relates to the policies that we make today and how that then affects people's health and well-being. Right now, we know that there's a childhood PTSD study that came out of Harvard that shows that the brain scans of children who experienced corporal punishment and abuse looks very similar to the brain scan of people who have been in combat. And so when we start to see the effects that childhood trauma can have on the central nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, even in families where there was a lot of love and there was a lot of, you know, stability and all of that, it starts to give us a closer look at why it's important for us to diagnose and recognize and try to reckon with the hardest parts of our childhood.
You talk about families where there was a lot of love and a lot of support. I love when I started reading your book because you look at the title and you go, okay, slavery, and it's about his family, and he's going to start out, and there's going to be this, this poor kid who didn't have a dad, who grew up in hard times. It doesn't start out like that at all. And I love that you start out talking about your upbringing in Minnesota. You talk about the strong Black men in your family. You talk about the community that helps shape who you are. And then you talk about being taken out of that into a different type of community. And there it really kind of starts to all unravel with your family's history. Kind of talk about those two different experiences. Because look, I'm Gen X too, right? So we were in that period where, as I've heard you describe it, first generation integrated Black people, right? And our families were told and thought, take our kids out of Black communities and put them in predominantly white communities where there are better schools, where there are better neighborhoods, better opportunities. But that had an impact.
It did, both bad and good. I think that it's a classic American reality. We see people right now who are coming from different countries and trying to fight to be here because they want their children to have better schools and better opportunities. And so we were a subset of that. And I call myself a first generation American because I'm part of the first generation in my family to be born with full constitutional rights, even though my family's been here since the 1600s, and I'm a descendant of Revolutionary War soldiers and Civil War soldiers. And so this idea of people on the fringes, whether that be Black people or Latinos or Asian people or, immigrants who are coming into this country from all over the world, it's about us trying to find our sense of belonging in pursuit of the American dream and wanting the best opportunity for our kids. And so for me, that meant that when my father did the Great Migration, which a lot of times we think that just because someone moved north, that it was always to pursue a better opportunity. But in my case, it was based on trauma that my father's mother had passed away, and his father wasn't in a position to take on 4 kids, and so they moved with their sister and her husband in Minnesota. And what did that do? Well, it did put an opportunity for my grandmother in her dying days to say, I want my kids to go north. And it did get them out of the Jim Crow system. And then my dad said, and my mother said, I want my kids to grow up in the suburbs. And so every
the great migration to the suburbs.
To the suburbs.
Yeah.
And every generation was trying to do better. But in the process of that, yes, there was trauma. And when we had, I'm not the only writer who's written about this. We have people writing about tiger moms or, different perfectionistic helicopter parents or whatever they're called. And it's not, in my case, meant to say, oh, woe is me. I had a terrible childhood. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is we have to look at the aspects of our childhood that touch us in a very tender place, almost to the point that we don't want to discuss it, the things that we're running from, the things that we don't want to challenge our parents on or our grandparents on because we feel it's disrespectful to criticize elders. And I think that right now, part of the First Amendment and free speech is that we have millennials and Generation Z people who are much more willing to have those conversations in the family. And I think what it's done is it's driven no contact situations where there's a breakdown in communication, and it may be because of politics, but a lot of times it's also because of unaddressed trauma. I was talking to a guy yesterday who has a very complicated relationship with his brother because his brother beat him up who was 5 years older, beat him up for his whole, preteen and into his teens.
Wow.
And they're grown men, and they still are trying to reckon with this happening. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is I was just in Minnesota, and I recognized when I brought a lot of the people who I went to high school with, who were primarily white Scandinavian people, into the same room with the people I went to church with and was in a lot of organizations with.
These two different
which was
worlds.
Primary black, and they came together. I recognized that, I was in the middle. I was an intermediary who really in some ways had an obligation to bring some of these issues to the fore and to get these conversations going in my family, but in the broader national family. And sometimes, to whom much is given, much is required. And everybody who is that has the opportunity to sometimes be the first generation in their family to do certain things carries that burden and that gift. Sure. And so that's what I want to inspire people to not be afraid to research their family histories and to interview family members and find out why they were raised the way they were, in both the good sense and then some of the more challenging things.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed in the 2 or 3 times that I've been in an audience with you is that this book and this research of yours opens that door. It's a story about a black family, but the impact of it is not just about black families. I've heard Native Americans, I've heard Jewish people, I've heard people who are LGBTQ, people of different cultures say, there's something here I can identify with. There's part of my history or my heritage that I see in the story that you've told. And I can see you take pride in that, because it seems that
really
part of your goal here is opening that door, using your family as an example to open that door so that other people ask those questions and have those conversations about their past.
That's true. If there's anything that I'm proud of, it's, I spoke in Utah. It was actually the campus where Charlie Kirk was murdered. And, so you can imagine this was for Martin Luther King Day, which makes sense because Dr. King stood for nonviolent social change. But they are a wonderful campus in the Utah Valley University, and the wound is still fresh. But what they have done is to try to bring in more speakers to foster more dialogue as an alternative to violence, which is exactly what we should be doing. If you think about the term university, I see it as unity in diversity, and that doesn't necessarily just mean race. It also means ideological thought. Yeah. And so the fact why I mentioned Utah is because, it's heavily Mormon, and the Mormon faith has done a really good job of building these companies, Ancestry.com, and putting all of this information on the databases that will allow all Americans and people all over the world to study their family histories. And but my work is more than just about using genealogy to determine more than just when someone was born and when they died, but actually to focus more on the dash in between. My grandfather's gone, but what was his life like? And maybe I can interview some of his siblings or somebody he used to work with, or maybe I can study the town that he or she came from, and I can figure out why it was that, I was never allowed to cry, or why was it that I got hit with a belt, or why was it that they moved away, and all of these different things. And so sometimes we don't necessarily need a person to be here in order to get sense to understand why, because a lot of times people can be, treated terribly, or they can have little idiosyncrasies that they remember from their family member, but never really understand why. I'll give you one quick example. My dear cousin, Pinky, who was a a really strong supporter.
I love Pinky.
Black
Everybody's got to have a cousin named Pinky. I'm pretty sure I probably have a cousin named Pinky.
And she, may she rest in peace, but she was somebody who was very generous with the family history and actually gave me the family Bible at a family reunion, which has been in the family for generations. But after she passed away, my cousin told me at the funeral, he said, you know, whenever we would have a meal, particularly the big meals, my mom would not eat. She refused to eat until we, the children, ate. And we would be sitting there and we would start, she would say, go ahead and eat. And we would start eating. And then we'd say, Mom, go eat, go eat. And finally she would go and fix herself a plate and sit down. And they'd say, Mom, why do you always let us eat first? And she'd say, because when I was a kid on the farm, there was the rule that the adults ate first.
That's right.
And as a kid, you know, that sort of, if you really think about it, it sort of mirrors the role or the order of things and the hierarchy and where American children in particular stand on that. You know, I mentioned that there's in 17 states they can hit children in the schools with a wooden board. You can't do that to an adult, right? Yet children are the most vulnerable in our society, but they have the least protections. And so I really loved Pinky because she always respected us when we were kids.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think the idea is what kind of world do we want to create for our children? Do we want to raise our children like they're still in slavery or that they're still in Jim Crow or they're still coming out in the Great Depression or something? Or do we want to look at the way that the world has changed and look at the science that's showing us the effects on the body and the health and well-being and how childhood traumatized the life expectancy? And so once again, when we know better, we do better. And all my book is trying to do is to get into those difficult subjects so that we can have a better family and a better nation.
Sure. So in the couple of minutes we have left, you mentioned something, and I want to make maybe a little bit of a left turn, but I think it's related to what you're talking about here. Sort of looking forward. So you mentioned Utah. I love that you brought up Utah. I spent a month in Utah one time.
You did?
Yeah. And people say it was actually for the, I was a journalist. I was covering the Olympics. And it was 2002. And I spent a month in Utah. And people said to me, you're a black girl? You're going to go spend a month in Utah? That's kind of weird. And I said, yeah, I am. Because A, my job told me I'm going. But like, I'm really excited to go somewhere that I didn't know. And I learned so much. I really enjoyed that month. I was a new mom. I had to drop my daughter off with my mom. My husband was like, I don't know if I can do this baby thing for a month. But I spent a month in Utah, and I loved immersing myself in a place and in a culture that was very different than what I was familiar with. But boy, did I meet some lovely people. Got to go to some homes, spend some time with people, and in between doing all the 12-hour shifts and whatnot. But I'm glad you brought that up in your recent trip after what happened with Charlie Kirk and America's response to that. And we talk so much about living in a polarized society where we've got people on who can't bridge differences. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you've been a journalist, you've covered a lot of the world, you're now an author. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how we move forward bridging differences. You have described yourself as someone who has been shaped by very different ideologies, and you have been open to that, and you have embraced that. What can we learn from that?
Well, I think the thing that made and I wrote down some thoughts here, the thing that made my parents and my grandparents and everything focus a lot on education was because they understood that knowledge is power and that I couldn't succeed in the world without being I was already fundamentally a curious person. And also, being the descendant of a Vietnam era veteran, I think that I also am very patriotic. I think that everybody claims to love the country, and I never challenge people's love for our nation, but I think patriotism has been oversimplified. I think a lot of times we tend to sanitize American stories for the sake of feeling that, just like when I said, if you criticize an elder or you question an elder, it's disrespectful. Well, the same thing if you question the nation. What's the first thing that we're taught when we walk into kindergarten? That George Washington cut down the cherry tree and he told his father, I refuse to tell a lie. Well, in some ways, that's like, I don't know what to call it, social engineering, conspiratorial, I don't know what it is, or maybe it's just a nice little story. But what does it do? It programs us from the beginning to say, never question the nation. And I think that, in a way, to not question our government is the least patriotic thing that we can do, to not have tolerance for and not to invite people to come forward with disruptive concepts that force us to really constantly ask ourselves, are we doing the best that we can to live up to the democratic principles that are in our Constitution, or are we perpetuating the mythology of democracy, which we've continued to do for generation after generation, to the point that we even, I think, are hostile to the concept of people talking facts about history. One of the most hostility triggering statements that I make a lot of times is that, America is, for all of its existence, except for 60 years, it's been a white supremacist legal world. Like that white supremacy was the law. That's not a political statement. That is a fact, that for all but 60 years of our existence, white people were the people who had all the full rights. And so racism or racial equality is a very new concept in America, right? And I think that's why we're having these issues, not because we're consciously aware of that, but deep down, almost in an epigenetic way, there are things that, assumptions that we make that we maybe don't speak out loud about people who are different than us, or on the fringes, or minoritized people, that are not really true to the concept of equality. And this is why I'm so proud and happy to be in Gettysburg, because it's made me reflect a lot on Lincoln. And I just wrote down a couple concepts that I just wanted to touch on. He said that these dead shall not have died in vain. That's from the Gettysburg Address, where he's addressing the soldiers that fought on the Union side. And for me, I had found out in my book that I had a family member murdered every generation since 1837 because of the racial violence in the South, including my grandfather was murdered, and both of my great-grandfathers were murdered. My grandmother was 9 when her father was murdered, and my grandfather was 5 when his father was murdered. What was the effect of that? I'll give you one example. Well, when my grandfather's father was murdered, he had to quit school, and so did his brother, so they could support the 8 children and their mother. And as a result of that, yes, you talk about me and all of the things that I've been able to accomplish as at the Wall Street Journal for 19 years and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. But my grandfather, Lee Hawkins, could not read. And that was something that I found out when I did my research, and then my father then confirmed that. And we're only a generation, removed from that. Right, and there are a lot of Americans of all races who a lot of people don't even know it. You could go to the halls of Morehouse, or you could go to the halls of Harvard, and find people who are descendants of people who didn't have the opportunity to learn how to read. And so, the industrial economy was really about hard work, and the creative economy is more about knowledge work. And so we're all blessed to be there. But those people who died, that had the bloodshed of being killed for their land, left behind children who were traumatized by that. And that was why I got the belt, because my parents were afraid that if I made mistakes, I could be killed. And we're murder survivors, right? And so there's been a lot of bloodshed in this nation because of fighting over resources and things like that. And so why was that important for me to dig in? I'll tell you, because my great-grandfather who was murdered, my grandmother sat through a trial. All of her brothers and sisters sat through 3 trials only to see the white man who killed him for his land and over a dispute of livestock, ended up getting acquitted. And they had to live with the fact that there was never any closure. So what did that do? I became an investigative reporter. I met the people from the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, which is the lynching museum. And I was able to file all the necessary proof and paperwork that ended up getting my great-grandfather recognized on the legacy sites, where his name will now be in Butler County, Alabama, as a lynching victim. And we will finally get the closure and the acknowledgement of what happened to him. So knowledge is power. And every generation that gets it has to do their job to try to improve their bloodline and to bury a lot of the dark aspects of things that happen, and carry forward the things that we can be proud of about our heritage.
Yeah. Lee Hawkins doing the unfinished work. Lincoln would be proud of you. He talked about that in that 2-minute speech, and we could. There's so many things that we could get into, but they're going to have to come and watch the Scharf lecture, or watch it after the fact, or listen to this podcast. But thank you so much.
Yes,
thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I also met with some students today. Very impressive institution, and beautiful town, and I hope to get a chance to explore it more.
I hope you do. Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your perspective.
Thanks.